When I moved to this small, picturesque town nestled between a winding river and dense woods, I told myself it was the fresh start I desperately needed. After years of living in the city, endless noise, constant pressure, and a messy breakup that left me with a bitter taste, I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere simple. I had landed a fully remote job as a data analyst and decided that living in a place where I could breathe clean air and wake up to silence instead of car horns would do wonders for my peace of mind. The town, with its cobblestone streets, cozy cafes, and friendly locals, seemed perfect. The house I rented was a small but charming place with a wraparound porch and just enough space for one person. The rent was cheap, and the landlord had even thrown in a few pieces of rustic furniture to make it feel homier. My nearest neighbor was an older man, maybe in his 50s, who introduced himself the day I moved in. He was tall and wiry, with salt and pepper hair and an easygoing smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, handing me a plate of cookies. "If you need anything, directions, recommendations, anything at all, just come by." I thanked him, and over the next few days, we'd occasionally wave to each other when I was out on the porch and he was working in his yard. It was nice knowing there was someone friendly nearby. The first week passed like a dream. I spent my mornings working in the small home office I had set up, and my afternoons exploring the town. There was a charming little square with a fountain at the center, surrounded by boutique shops and bakeries. Everyone I met seemed kind. Shopkeepers who greeted me warmly, a couple of kids playing on the sidewalks, even strangers who nodded in passing as if I'd lived here for years. I'd never felt this at ease in the city. One afternoon, I walked into a small cafe tucked in the corner of the square. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods hit me the moment I stepped inside, and I found a table by the window. As I sipped my coffee and worked on my laptop, I noticed someone sitting a couple of tables over. A woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s, with dark, wavy hair and a friendly, open face. She caught my eye once and smiled briefly before going back to her book. After about 20 minutes, I decided to take a chance. I walked over, introduced myself, and asked if she was new in town too. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Actually, yes," she said. "I moved here last month for work. Thought I'd give small-town life a try." We ended up talking for over an hour, sharing stories about why we moved and what we hoped to find here. Her voice was calm, soothing, and she had this way of making me feel like I'd known her for years. Before leaving, I asked if we could stay in touch, and she gave me her number. It was the first time in a long while that I'd felt genuinely optimistic about something. Over the next few days, I texted her a few times, and we even made tentative plans to grab dinner later that week. Things were looking up, work was going well, I was meeting new people, and the town itself seemed idyllic. But then, little things started happening. It began one evening when I decided to take a walk through the park. The sun was setting, casting everything in a warm orange glow, and the air was crisp and cool. I noticed a couple standing by a row of trees in the distance. They weren't walking, talking, or doing anything. Really, just standing still, facing my direction. I thought maybe they were admiring the sunset, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't looking at the horizon. They were looking at me. Both of them had wide, fixed smiles on their faces, but it wasn't a friendly kind of smile. It was off, too wide, too stiff, like their faces couldn't quite hold the expression naturally. I felt a shiver run through me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe they were just locals being a little too curious about the new guy. I turned and walked in the other direction, pretending I hadn't noticed. When I glanced back over my shoulder, the couple was gone. The next day, I ran into my neighbor while taking out the trash. He asked how I was settling in, and I told him about how nice the town was. I didn't mention the couple in the park. I didn't want to come off as paranoid. He nodded and said, "Glad to hear it. Just be careful around here. Some folks might seem a little strange at first, but they mean well. Most of them, anyway." His tone was light, but there was something about the way he said "most of them" that stuck with me. Later that week, I went to the grocery store to pick up some essentials. While I was browsing the aisles, I noticed a man at the far end of the store standing by the frozen food section. He was facing me, smiling that same unnaturally wide smile. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should approach or just ignore him. Before I could decide, he turned and walked away, disappearing behind one of the shelves. By now, I was starting to feel unsettled. I texted the woman from the cafe to see if she wanted to grab dinner sooner than planned, but she didn't reply. I told myself she was probably just busy with work. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard a faint sound outside, like footsteps crunching on gravel. My bedroom window faced the front yard, so I peeked through the blinds, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or my imagination, but sleep didn't come easily that night. A couple of days later, I decided to stop by her house. I figured if she wasn't answering her phone, maybe she'd be up for a quick visit. When I got there, the curtains were drawn, and the house looked eerily still. I knocked on the door, then again, louder. No answer. I stepped back, hesitating, and then walked around to one of the side windows to peek inside. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the living room, her back to the window. She wasn't moving. I knocked on the glass, calling her name, but she didn't respond. Slowly, she turned around, and my stomach dropped. Her grin was impossibly wide, stretching across her face in a way that didn't look human. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran straight home. I banged on my neighbor's door, desperate for answers. He opened it, his face somber, and listened as I told him everything. When I finished, he sighed and said, "I hoped you wouldn't have to deal with this." Then he told me about the smiling people, how they weren't human, how they could make you one of them if you interacted with them too much. "You can't engage them," he said. "Avoid eye contact. Avoid everything." I didn't want to believe him, but the terror in his eyes was undeniable. "What about her?" I asked. "The girl. Is there any way to help her?" His expression darkened, and he shook his head. "Once they get you, there's no coming back." I felt my chest tighten. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. But then, as I sat there trying to process what he'd said, I felt something shift, like the atmosphere around us had changed. "What's wrong?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He was staring at the window behind me. I turned slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. There, standing just outside the window, was a man I didn't recognize. His face was pressed close to the glass. His wide grin stretched unnaturally, and his head was tilted at an angle that looked painfully wrong. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared with that grotesque, toothy expression. My neighbor grabbed my arm and yanked me back from the window. "Don't look at them for too long," he hissed. "Close the curtains. Now." My hands trembled as I fumbled to draw the heavy fabric shut, the sensation of that unrelenting gaze burning into my mind. When the window was finally covered, my neighbor let out a slow, shaky breath. They know now. They've seen you. Seen me? What does that mean? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. You said not to engage them, but what am I supposed to do if they're staring at me through my own damn window? He paced the small living room, muttering under his breath. They'll start testing you, he said finally. They want to see how far you'll go. You can't give them anything, no attention, no reaction. If they think you're weak, he trailed off, his face pale. You need to leave. Pack your things and go, tonight. I stared at him, stunned. Leave? Just like that? What about my house? My job? I can't just disappear. He gripped my shoulder tightly, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. You don't have a choice, he said. Once they've marked you, they don't stop. It's not about your house or your job anymore. It's about survival. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend how my peaceful new life had unraveled so quickly. If I leave, what about you? What about everyone else in this town? I asked, hoping for some shred of reassurance. He shook his head. Most of us have learned to live with them, to stay out of their way. But you're new. They're drawn to that. He looked away, his voice dropping. You've already seen too much. I wanted to argue, to insist there had to be another way. But before I could speak, there was a sharp knock at the door. My neighbor froze, his eyes wide with fear. He motioned for me to stay silent, pressing a finger to his lips as he moved cautiously toward the peephole. I held my breath as he looked outside. His shoulders stiffened. It's them, he whispered. They've never come to my door before. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, the sound echoing through the house. Then it stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scratching, nails dragging across the wood. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but my neighbor motioned for me to stay still. Don't open it, he said. No matter what they say, no matter what you hear. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. For a few agonizing minutes, the scratching continued, and then it stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. My neighbor peeked out the window, then backed away quickly. They're gone, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. Go home, pack your things, but keep the lights off. Don't let them see you moving around. I'll come by in an hour to check on you. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay, I nodded and slipped out the back door, avoiding the streetlights as I made my way home. When I reached my porch, I hesitated before unlocking the door, half expecting to see someone, or something, waiting inside. But the house was quiet, untouched. I hurried to my bedroom and grabbed a suitcase, throwing in clothes and anything else I thought I might need. As I moved around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The curtains were drawn, but I could swear I heard faint footsteps outside, circling the house. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, zipping up the suitcase and heading for the front door. That's when I saw her. Through the small window by the door, I caught a glimpse of the woman from the cafe. She was standing on my front lawn, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Maybe she was okay. Maybe she was here to warn me. But then she turned around, and my stomach dropped. That same unnaturally wide grin, those vacant, unblinking eyes. She raised one hand and waved slowly, with stiff movements. I stumbled back, dropping the suitcase. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the suitcase instead. I grabbed it and headed for the back door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard something that stopped me cold. A voice, soft and familiar. "Why are you leaving?" It was hers. She was speaking, but the tone was all wrong. Flat, monotone, like the words were being read off a script. My hand shook as I gripped the doorknob, willing myself to keep going. Then came the laughter, soft at first, like a faint chuckle carried on the wind. But it didn't stay faint for long. It grew louder, sharper, echoing from all around me as if the walls of the house were amplifying the sound. It wasn't just her laughter anymore. There were others, deeper voices, lighter giggles, and something that sounded like a child's shrill cackle. The noise closed in, suffocating me with its unnatural rhythm, each voice overlapping in a discordant harmony that seemed to seep into my very bones. My pulse roared in my ears as I backed away from the door, clutching the suitcase like it was a shield. Then, the lights flickered violently before cutting out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The laughter continued, but now it wasn't just outside. It was inside, filling every room, coming from places too close to be possible. I fumbled for my phone, the small screen lighting up the immediate area around me. In the faint glow, I caught movement to my right. I turned sharply, the phone's light falling on the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I forced my feet to move. I bolted for the back door, my suitcase banging against my legs as I ran. Just as my fingers closed around the handle, I felt something brush against the back of my neck, light, almost like fingertips grazing my skin. I whipped around, my phone's light jerking wildly. The laughter stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it was like my ears had popped. My chest heaved as I scanned the room, but it was empty. I turned back to the door, my hand trembling as I twisted the lock. The handle wouldn't budge. It was stuck, like it had fused into the frame, or someone from the other side was holding it closed. My phone flickered, and for a horrifying moment, the light revealed a figure standing just inches away from me, too fast for me to register details, but unmistakably there. I stumbled back with a shout, dropping the suitcase and my phone. The screen landed face down, plunging me into pitch black. I scrambled to pick it up, but my fingers closed around something else instead. Something cold and brittle, like the dried limb of a dead tree. I recoiled, shaking my hand as I crawled blindly across the floor. The laughter resumed, louder than ever, this time accompanied by whispering. The voices were soft and urgent, speaking words I couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. They were mocking me, taunting me. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, circling me as I finally found my phone and flicked the light back on. My suitcase was gone. I staggered to my feet, the beam of my phone cutting through the dark, and ran back toward the front of the house. The windows were still covered, the curtains rippling as if stirred by a phantom breeze. I hesitated, knowing I had to get out but terrified of what might be waiting outside. Just then, there was a sharp knock at the front door, loud enough to make me jump. It was followed by another and another until the pounding was relentless, shaking the entire frame. I backed away, only to hear the same knocking start at the windows. My instincts screamed at me to get out, so I turned and bolted for the stairs. Maybe I could climb out of an upstairs window, find a way down from the roof. The second floor was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I hurried to the first bedroom, throwing the door open and heading straight for the window. But as I reached for the latch, I saw it. The smiling man from earlier, standing in the middle of the backyard, staring directly at me. His head tilted further than before. His grin stretched wider, splitting his face in an impossible way. His arm slowly lifted, and he pointed directly at me. My body screamed to move, but I was paralyzed by his gaze. Then, as if the air itself shifted, I felt a presence behind me. I didn't dare turn around. The sound of labored breathing filled the room, each exhale loud and raspy, like something huge was looming over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a trick of my mind, before forcing myself to move. I spun around, slamming my shoulder into whatever was there as I bolted for the hallway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I barreled into the bathroom, locking the door behind me and collapsing against it. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might stop altogether. The knocking began again, this time at the bathroom door, slow and deliberate, as if it knew I was trapped. "Let us in," a voice hissed, low and guttural. The doorknob rattled, then stopped, replaced by the sound of nails dragging down the wood, slow and deliberate. In a surge of panic, I kicked open the small bathroom window and climbed through, scraping my hands and knees on the frame. The cold night air hit me like a shock, but I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran toward my car, glancing over my shoulder to see shadows moving in the windows of my house, their grins glowing faintly in the dark. The laughter followed me, growing louder and faster as I reached the car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking violently, before finally getting the door unlocked. As I slid into the driver's seat, I looked up and saw the smiling woman standing in the middle of the road ahead. Behind her, more figures emerged from the darkness, all wearing that same grotesque expression, their eyes glinting like glass in the moonlight. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed out of the driveway. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following me, waiting for me to stop. If you ever find yourself in a place where the smiles don't feel right, where they stretch too wide, hold too long, and carry something dark behind them, leave. Don't ask questions, don't try to understand, just go. There are things in this world that wear the faces of people but aren't human. They'll watch you, wait for you to slip, and once they get close enough, you won't leave the same. I made it out, but I'll never stop running, never stop looking over my shoulder, because I know they're still out there. Whatever you do, don't stop moving, and never, ever smile back.